So if we talk about housing need, basically there's four areas of housing need I want to address. It's housing need is much more than how much can I pay, even though that's one of the major indicators that we discuss oftentimes within our programs as housing advocates and the work that we do. But I also want to touch on, beyond affordability, the availability of housing that's out there, which is a major impediment, the accessibility of housing, including how do we access existing housing, but also that accessibility to services, transportation, other things that are necessary, and then also the adequacy of housing. So it's one thing to be housed, but that housing also has to be conducive to the health of and supporting health, and that would include, running water, or not being overcrowded, those kind of issues that we're facing. So let's look at some of these as we go through today. Let's start with affordability, which seems to be the major indicator that we look at. Certainly from HUD's definition from the Federal Housing and Urban Development, 30%, paying no more than 30% of your income towards rent and utilities is considered affordable. Okay. That's pretty much a standard that all housing advocates have used, regardless if it's HIV specific. If we look at the Out of Reach report, which is produced annually by the National Low Income Housing Coalition, this just gives us a baseline to kind of base what we're going to be talking about around HIV. But a household that would earn, right over $26,000 a year could afford a two-bedroom unit at the FMR of $655. So basically, you would have to be earning for that household at least that amount of money. Now, my question to throw out is, how many people with HIV and AIDS do we know make that kind of money? Very few, right? Yeah. Okay. Exactly. So automatically what we know is that there's going to be an affordability issue, and that even at the standard, the fair market rent is what HUD has established and said this is what's a normal rent, this what everybody should be able to afford, so we call that the fair market rent, and that would include both that rent and utilities. And so we begin to see quickly that people living with HIV are really going to be severely housing burdened. Housing burden is that the percentage of income that is being contributed or going towards that rent and that utility payment is going over that 30%. So the higher that we go in that percentage, the worse off we believe a family would be. So if we think 30% is the standard, what HUD says this is where everybody should be at, what we find is among people living with HIV and AIDS, because they're disproportionately living in poverty and low income, that housing burden actually increases. So the lower the income, the higher the rent burden goes up, or the housing burden. Okay. And it's not unusual to see extreme housing burden at 50% or more among people living with HIV and AIDS. And so that's something that we become very concerned with, because obviously in that kind of situation where you have somebody paying over 50% of their income towards rent and utilities, what we quickly realize is that you're going to have some kind of support, either increasing of income, which is not always possible when somebody is disabled or their health is compromised, or we're going to have additional resources for rental assistance or supportive environments to make that more affordable. And so we quickly see that. And some of the research that I did, also we see this connection that housing burden is an indicator of housing need among people living with HIV, but also living in distressed communities. This would be communities of poverty, high unemployment, lower education, areas where there's extreme housing stress. So a lot of communities where there's housing that's poor housing, inadequate housing, overcrowding. Those kind of areas also contribute to housing need, and living in a rural area contributes to housing needs. So it's almost like an overlay, if you will. I'm already rent burdened, but because I live in this type of community, that also contributes to my housing need. So we see this connection between the environment where an individual may live and also how it impacts their own individual condition.